How did a mere student of Plato become one of the greatest thinkers of all time? Welcome to Collapse, where history comes to life, and each video immerses you in the destiny of those who shaped the world. Today, get ready to explore the colossal legacy of Aristotle, the philosopher who marked centuries of human thought. Disciple of Plato, mentor to Alexander the Great, he revolutionized philosophy, science, politics, and logic, influencing both the Middle Ages and our modern world. Methodical reasoning, insatiable curiosity, encyclopedic knowledge. His work has spanned the ages, nourishing both theologians and scientists. But beyond his immense legacy, who was Aristotle, the man behind the intellect? But before embarking on a new adventure, remember to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss anything. Thank you, and enjoy the journey. In the 4th century before Christ, the Mediterranean world and beyond experienced profound political upheavals, vibrant cultural exchanges, and military rivalries that would shape history enduringly. To fully understand the era in which Aristotle would be born and evolve, it is essential to paint a global picture of the international situation, then focus more specifically on the Greek context. The Achaemenid Empire, often called the Persian Empire, remains one of the most impressive powers of the ancient world. Founded in the 6th century before Christ by Cyrus the Great, it then covers an immense territory ranging from the western borders of Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey, to the eastern edges of Central Asia, passing through Mesopotamia, the region of present-day Iraq, Egypt, and a portion of the Mediterranean coast. This phenomenal expansion is due to a relatively tolerant administration for the time, allowing the different provinces, called satrapies, to maintain their traditions and customs while recognizing the central authority of the great Persian king. Around the time when Aristotle would be born, the Achaemenid dynasty is solid, even though it has to contend with sporadic uprisings and the ever-growing ambition of certain satrapies desiring more autonomy. Persian kings such as Artaxerxes II and later Darius III employ large armies capable of mobilizing various peoples and facing external threats, notably incursions by rival Greek city-states. The Persians are also recognized for their vast infrastructure projects. They maintain an efficient network of roads, like the famous Royal Road, which facilitates the circulation of messages as well as commercial and military movements. These land routes connect many parts of the empire and promote cultural exchanges on an incomparable scale for the era. Within the Achaemenid Empire, Egypt stands out as one of the key territories. Conquered by the Persians towards the end of the 6th century before Christ, it remains an important granary and a center of ancient knowledge. Although under Persian domination, Egypt preserves an exceptional cultural heritage. Its religious traditions, funerary practices, and vision of power, strongly anchored in the notion of the pharaoh god, continue to exert a major influence on local populations. The Achaemenid rulers attempt, with varying degrees of success, to present themselves as legitimate pharaohs, thus respecting the sacred protocol and the millennia-old customs of the Nile. This approach allows them to limit revolts, though Persian authority in Egypt is regularly challenged by local uprisings. The Egyptian economy of the time, based on agriculture irrigated by the river's floods, also provides logistical support to the Persian armies, which rely on the country's wealth to finance their campaigns. To the east of the Achaemenid Empire, India is then a politically fragmented continent, but already very rich culturally and spiritually. In the 4th century before Christ, several kingdoms vie for preeminence, particularly in the Gangetic Plain, region of the Ganges River. Among them, the kingdom of Magadha stands out and begins its rise by influencing neighboring territories. A century later, this will be the starting point of the Maurya Empire, which will succeed in uniting a large part of the Indian subcontinent under its authority. During the period of interest, the Indian communities are very diverse. There are urban city-states, regional powers, and small rural kingdoms. Cultural exchanges with the West, although limited by rugged terrain and deserts, already exist, thanks to the trade of precious goods such as spices, gemstones, or textiles. Caravans thus cross Central Asia and sometimes reach Persian networks. This nascent trade linkage will strengthen in the following decades and play a crucial role in the dissemination of philosophical and scientific ideas, including those later carried by the followers of Aristotle and other Greek thinkers. In the far east of Asia, China is going through the period known as the Warring States, which extends approximately from the late 5th century to the 3rd century before Christ. It is a phase of major upheaval, marked by the gradual fall of the Zhou dynasty, in favor of warlords occupying different rival principalities. The states of Qi, Chu, Qin, Yan, Han, Wei, and Zhao compete to expand their territory and assert their supremacy. Conflicts are frequent, alliances fluctuating, and political violence is accompanied by significant administrative and military advancements. It is also a crucial moment for the intellectual development of China. Although Confucius had already died in the 5th century, his disciples continue to transmit his teachings, while other schools of thought, such as Taoism or legalism, gain a considerable following. Unceasing wars drive innovation, the search for governance strategies, and maintaining order. In this context, fortified cities are reinforced, arsenals expand, and society is further structured around the ruling and military classes. While it is unlikely that Aristotle had direct knowledge of these events in China, it is important to recall that at the same time, at the edges of Asia, an exceptionally vibrant intellectual hub emerged where unique political and philosophical ideals were shaped. Despite the distance and geographical barriers, the Mediterranean, the Middle East, and Asia begin to interconnect via land routes, often called proto-Silk roads, and maritime communications, primarily along the coastlines of the Indian Ocean. Although these trade routes are not yet unified, as they will be under the Roman Empire or later under the Han Chinese dynasty, they already allow the circulation of goods, precious metals, spices, and even exotic animals. These economic flows are accompanied by an initial diffusion of philosophical, religious, and scientific ideas. The major ports, located in the eastern Mediterranean or along the Persian Gulf, become meeting places where merchants, diplomats, and intellectuals from various backgrounds mingle. The Phoenicians, famous for their navigational skills, also play a role in the rise of these exchanges, as do some Greek cities established on the coast of Asia Minor. While the notions of state, administrative management, or diplomacy remain fundamentally different from one civilization to another, this intermingling foreshadows a movement of mutual curiosity and cultural borrowing that will intensify in the following centuries. On the territory we now call Greece, the political and cultural reality is centered around city-states, also known as polis, each jealous of its autonomy and institutions. Among the most influential in the 4th century before Christ, we find Athens, Sparta, and Thebes, but there are many other more modest poles, such as Corinth, Argos, or Rhodes, which sometimes seek to expand their sphere of influence. Each of these cities has its own army, customs, and specific political organization, be it democracies, as in Athens, oligarchies, or diarchies, as in Sparta. In this political mosaic, wars are frequent. The city-states regularly attempt to impose their domination on neighboring regions, leading to complex alliances and large-scale conflicts. These internal rivalries partly explain the ease with which some invaders or external powers, such as the Persian Empire in the past or later Macedonia, have been able to interfere in Greek affairs. Despite these divisions, Greek-speaking and culturally Greek city-states still share strong elements of common identity, such as religion, the worship of Zeus, Apollo, Athena, the Pan-Hellenic Games, including the Olympic Games, or the widespread practice of philosophy, which begins to radiate throughout the Aegean basin. In the 5th century before Christ, Athens experienced its golden age, particularly under the impetus of Pericles, an influential statesman who led the city in the first half of that century. It was a period of unprecedented cultural flourishing, with major achievements in architecture, the Parthenon on the Acropolis, sculpture, mythology-inspired friezes, and literature, the tragedies of Sophocles and Euripides, the comedies of Aristophanes. However, this Athenian prosperity clashed violently with the ambitions of other city-states, particularly Sparta. The Peloponnesian Wars, which take place from 431 before Christ to 404 before Christ, mainly oppose Athens and Sparta, but draw in nearly the entire Greek world. This long series of conflicts exhausts resources, depopulates certain regions, and causes profound upheavals in political alliances. At the end of the war, Sparta emerges as the dominant power, while Athens, defeated, sees its fleet largely destroyed and its maritime empire dismantled. Its fortifications are demolished, and it must endure an oligarchic regime imposed by the victors, known as the 30 Tyrants. Although Athenian democracy eventually gets restored, the city never regains the splendor and hegemony it once exerted over the Aegean Sea. This relative decline, which began following the defeat, continues into the first half of the 4th century before Christ, precisely the period when Aristotle will be born. While these great southern cities continue to quarrel or painfully recover from the conflicts of the previous century, a new power emerges in the north of Greece, Macedonia. This kingdom, long considered by the southern city-states as semi-barbaric and on the periphery of the Greek world, will significantly expand its military and political capabilities under the reign of Philip II. Philip II is a remarkable strategist who notably introduces the Macedonian phalanx, a more flexible and formidable military formation than the old hoplite formations of the city-states. Moreover, he relies on diplomacy and political marriage to consolidate his alliances while reforming the economy of his kingdom through the exploitation of rich gold and silver mines in the region. Philip II, aware of the importance of intellectual and cultural relations with the South, welcomes scholars and artists to his court. Ultimately, this policy of openness lays the groundwork for his son, Alexander the Great, who will inherit a seasoned army and a solid state. Meanwhile, Macedonian progress worries the Greek city-states, Athens, which is slowly recovering, and Thebes, which had begun a rise for a time, sometimes seek to counter Philip II's influence. However, despite attempts at alliances or coalitions, they failed to durably halt Macedonian expansion. In parallel with the military and political upheavals, Greek intellectual life remains intense. In the previous century, the philosopher Socrates profoundly influenced minds with his method of questioning, his rejection of all forms of dogmatic knowledge, and his quest for the definition of virtue. Although he wrote nothing, his disciples, among whom are Plato and Xenophon, spread his ideas in different directions. Socrates also left the memory of a tragic condemnation. Accused of impiety and corrupting the youth, he is sentenced to drink hemlock in 399 before Christ, an event that demonstrates the tension between certain currents of thought and the city of Athens at this pivotal moment. The death of Socrates leaves a void and prompts his disciples to further structure their schools of thought. Plato, one of Socrates' most brilliant successors, founds the Academy around 387 before Christ in Athens. Over the decades, this place becomes a major center of study, dedicated to philosophy, mathematics, and all sorts of speculations on politics, the nature of knowledge, or the ideal construction of the city. Plato dispenses teaching based on dialogue, partially inherited from Socrates, while developing his own theory of ideas, which emphasizes the distinction between the sensible world and the intelligible world. Among the many students of the Academy are notable personalities such as Xenocrates and Speusippus, who will continue to shape Greek philosophy. Here we are in 384 before Christ, in the region of Chalcidice, in northern Greece, on the peninsula that juts into the Aegean Sea. More precisely, we are in Stagira, a small city still little known to the general public at this time, but which will become famous thanks to the birth of a child destined to leave his mark on the history of human thought, Aristotle. This town, also called Stagira by some ancient authors, is located by the coast near pine forests and rocky hills. One must imagine a busy port where fishing boats occasionally mingle with modest merchant ships, loaded with goods from different regions of the Mediterranean. Aristotle is thus born in this quiet place, far from major intellectual centers such as Athens, Sparta, or Thebes. He is not, however, isolated from the world, as Stagira is located at the crossroads of trade routes linking Macedonia to the cities of the Aegean coast. The caravans and boats passing through there allow the inhabitants to have access to a variety of goods, agricultural provisions, metallurgy tools, or even fabrics. This geographical configuration already prepares young Aristotle to open up to different currents of thought, whether they come from Greek cities, Thracian influences, or even from other more distant lands. His family plays a decisive role in the course of his destiny. His father, named Nicomachus, is not a mere artisan or merchant. He practices as a physician at the royal court of Macedonia. In 4th century before Christ Greece, being at the service of a king implies a certain social status and a higher level of education than average. The medical knowledge that Nicomachus possesses is rooted in the Hippocratic tradition, already well recognized for its methodical approach to observation and treatment of patients. According to some ancient sources, Nicomachus claims a prestigious ancestry, linking his family to Asclepius, the Greek god of medicine. Whether this is purely a legendary connection or not, this claim underscores the importance the family places on medical science. Working as a physician for the Macedonian court also means frequenting the entourage of the king of Macedonia. At this time, the sovereign could be Amyntas III, or one of his close successors. This places the family in a leading political and intellectual network, as Macedonia is not yet quite the superpower it will become under Philip II, but it is already an increasingly influential kingdom in the region. Proximity to the court therefore allows access to circles of scholars and diplomats, and opens the way to an exchange of ideas that is not necessarily found in small, isolated cities. Aristotle grows up in this stimulating environment, where medicine, politics, and the observation of the world combine. The influence of his father's profession will forever mark his mind. It is also known that there is a maternal figure, often mentioned under the name Phaestus, originating from Chalcis, a city located on the island of Euboea. Sources are less verbose about her, but it is likely that she belongs to a relatively wealthy family, as marriages at that time often followed social and material considerations. From this union, Aristotle is born, a fragile newborn, but whose future will reveal a singular character. The family environment provides Aristotle with more than just financial means. The medical setting in which he is immersed becomes a catalyst for experiences and curiosities. Nicomachus's profession is not an abstract one. It requires concrete skills, an ability to carefully observe symptoms, to engage in dialogue with patients, and to experiment with different remedies. Furthermore, the major theme of bodily health is associated with the search for an overall balance, which the Greek tradition sometimes calls the golden mean. This notion of balance and measure will later be reflected in Aristotle's philosophical reflections, particularly when he delivers his teachings on ethics and virtue. Although we are only at the point of his birth and early years, one can already perceive, in the background, the importance of these influences. Beyond this family setting, Aristotle's early education begins under the direct guidance of his father. Nicomachus doesn't just heal, he reflects on the nature and causes of diseases, as Greek medicine is already based on a form of empiricism. The works attributed to Hippocrates, although partly composed in an earlier period, likely circulate at the Macedonian court or through various networks of scholars. When the situation allows, Nicomachus permits his son to observe, to stay in a corner of the room, to discover the doctor-patient relationship, or even to wander the halls of an aristocratic house where a noble is residing. At this stage, Aristotle obviously does not diagnose, but he observes and listens. He could thus hear technical exchanges, familiarize himself with rudimentary medical instruments, and mentally note the jargon used. This anecdote, often reported by historians of antiquity, illustrates the early awakening of a mind inclined towards investigation. In Greece of that era, it is uncommon to see a child have such access to the inner workings of specialized knowledge. It gives him a head start in terms of intellectual formation. Instead of being limited to epic tales of mythology or the simple learning of reading and writing, Aristotle is already attuned to practical reasoning methods. He discovers the necessity of asking questions, distinguishing verified facts from mere conjectures, and drawing cautious conclusions. This training will become the cornerstone of his thought process, a blend of rigorous logic and concrete observation. At the same time, in Macedonia, the intellectual situation is evolving rapidly. The region is increasingly attaching itself to the traditions of classical Greece. As the Macedonian royal house has geopolitical ambitions, it attracts teachers, artists, military advisors, and, of course, renowned doctors like Nicomachus. Even though Macedonia doesn't yet have the cultural brilliance of Athens, some indications suggest that a form of scientific curiosity is already implanted, encouraged by the need to improve social organization and court medicine. This early education is not solely about medical observations. In a wealthy family like Aristotle's, there is also a focus on transmitting the essentials of Greek cultural heritage. The boy learns to read and write in a version of the Greek language probably tinged with regional dialects. The teachers and tutors, aiming to prepare children of good families, ensure they know Homer's poetry, music, and later, oratory art and dialectic. Although Stagira is not a major philosophical center, the basics of literary and artistic disciplines remain essential for a young man to shine in future public debates or to secure his place in traditional Greek society. We can imagine the daily life of young Aristotle. He gets up early, as is the Greek custom, assisted by family servants or household slaves. After a frugal meal, he begins reviewing his lessons in recitation and arithmetic. Then, as his father prepares to conduct a consultation or to visit the Macedonian palace to see a notable, Aristotle follows or waits, carrying out writing and reading exercises under the supervision of a tutor. Walks in the surrounding countryside, punctuated by simple observations of plants and animals, complete this learning setup. For a child of his rank, everything around him becomes a source of study, even fascination. The other essential component of his education lies in the practice of music. Following Greek custom, he would have learned to play an instrument, perhaps the lyre or the aulos, and to sing religious and patriotic hymns. Music holds an important place in traditional Greek education, as it is believed to shape character and facilitate an understanding of harmony, a fundamental concept in art, morality, and later, philosophy. Few accounts explicitly mention Aristotle's interest in music at a young age, but it is known that he will speak of it later in his writings, suggesting that he recognizes its educational value. The years thus pass in a balance between cultural tradition and scientific interest. When the child Aristotle is 10 years old, his father is still the central figure in his world. However, it is likely that during his adolescence, Aristotle loses Nicomachus, as some ancient historians claim. A tutor or close relative would then have taken charge of the young man's remaining education. His mother, Phaestus, also seems to have died prematurely, so that Aristotle would have been orphaned during his early teenage years. Despite this ordeal, or perhaps partly because of it, he turns even more to study, finding in reading and intellectual exploration a form of refuge and aspiration. When Aristotle arrives in Athens in 367 before Christ, he is still only in his 20s, an age already considered suitable for pursuing higher education in the Greek world. At the time, Athens remains a cultural beacon. Despite the beginning of a political decline after the Peloponnesian War, the city retains its intellectual aura. It is precisely in this context that Aristotle will discover the Academy, an institution founded by Plato around 387 before Christ. The Athenians know it as the Academy of Plato, in reference to the sanctuary of the Greek hero Academus, near which Plato chose to establish his school. Plato is then a revered figure of Greek philosophy, born around 427. Before Christ, he was a disciple of Socrates and gained renown by transmitting the teachings of the latter while developing his own concepts, notably the theory of ideas or forms. In the city, few schools of thought can rival the influence now exercised by the Academy. This school offers an ambitious program encompassing philosophy, mathematics, geometry, astronomy, politics, and even music. But the dominant orientation, driven by Plato himself, remains fundamentally philosophical and mathematical. Numbers and abstract entities are considered vital keys for understanding the structure of reality. Newcomers pursue a curriculum that can vary according to their abilities. Some students focus on pure mathematics, while others engage in ethics discussions, the art of governance, and logic. The courses often take the form of dialogues, faithful to the method favored by Socrates and adopted by Plato. Under the colonnade of the gymnasium or in the gardens surrounding the school, the masters question their students to lead them to discover the truth on their own. Aristotle, who grew up in Macedonia in the medical environment of his father Nicomachus, is immediately captivated by these debates. His natural curiosity is fully expressed in this intellectual community, where ideas are constantly scrutinized and reevaluated. Very quickly, Aristotle shows exceptional diligence. As studious as he is attentive to the subtle nuances of philosophical thought, he stands out as one of the most promising students of the academy. Although the exact numbers of the school elude us, ancient accounts suggest that a small group of loyal followers forms around Plato. In this select circle, Aristotle distinguishes himself, noted for the quality of his interventions and his already advanced sense of structuring ideas. His critical mind, quick to challenge any approximate reasoning, soon places him among the preferred interlocutors for Plato. It is said that Plato, impressed, entrusted the young man with exercises aimed at perfecting not only his philosophical thought, but also his ability to transmit this knowledge, an essential aspect of the Socratic tradition. During these formative years, Aristotle formed strong intellectual bonds with other disciples of Plato. Among them are Xenocrates, known for his austerity and rigor, as well as Speusippus, Plato's nephew, who would later inherit the leadership of the academy. Xenocrates, born between 396 and 390, before Christ, is interested in mathematics, but also develops thoughts on metaphysics, actively participating in passionate debates about the nature of the soul and immaterial realities. Speusippus, on the other hand, undoubtedly inherits Plato's systematic spirit, while adding his own vision on the classification of knowledge. In this vibrant milieu, Aristotle, who has a keen interest in observing the physical world, notably due to his background in medicine and biology, sometimes finds himself at odds with the Platonic idealist tendency. For Plato, the world we perceive with our senses is merely an imperfect copy of a deeper and more immutable reality, the forms. Everything in our environment, be it a tree, a horse, or even an idea like justice, is just a reflection of a perfect model that exists on a higher plane, independent of the material world. These forms, eternal and immutable, never change, unlike physical objects that are born, evolve, and disappear. For Plato, only reason allows access to this superior reality, as our senses deceive us by confining us to a world of perpetual change. Aristotle already questions, how can the theory of forms be reconciled with the concrete reality that everyone can perceive and examine? He does not yet break with his master's idealism, but his more empirical inquiries begin to emerge. Within this tight-knit group, Aristotle is given a nickname revealing of his attitude toward knowledge. He is called the reader, in Greek anagnostes, as he immerses himself in texts to scrutinize each idea. The libraries of the academy, filled with works of philosophy, poetry, history, and mathematics, represent an invaluable treasure to him. His respect for the achievements of great thinkers of the past leads him to profoundly analyze existing treatises while feeding his own reflections. Exchanges with Xenocrates and Speusippus are not limited to simple courteous discussions. The operation of the academy is based on respectful and reasoned confrontation. Each contributes to the progress of the other. In fact, Aristotle never hesitates to engage in direct debate, preferring conceptual accuracy over courteous phrases. This freedom of expression, encouraged by Plato, strengthens the sense of belonging to a true research community. However, influences do not stop within the walls of the academy. Athens is home to other intellectual circles, with active sophists or famous orators like Isocrates, who advocates a more practical approach to teaching, focused on rhetoric and political training. Aristotle, curious about everything, surely considers these parallel currents, even though he remains deeply loyal to Plato during this period. The encounters he makes in the city, the speeches he listens to at public gatherings, form a panorama of varied ideas that will gradually nurture his own conception of philosophy and scientific knowledge. heart of the Academy, Aristotle dedicates himself to research that already heralds several major themes of his later career. He is interested in mathematics, an essential domain under Plato's influence, but shows a particularly growing interest in logic, a discipline that seeks to determine how to formulate valid reasoning. Even though Plato emphasized dialectics as a form of philosophical investigation, Aristotle proposes to formalize these thought processes. It is not yet the systematic logic that will be found decades later in the Organon, a collection of treatises written by Aristotle. Yet, a seed is being planted. He begins to distinguish different ways of constructing reasoning, to identify fallacies, to clarify the links between premises and conclusion. This marks the early stage of what will be called formal logic. This approach, which prioritizes argumentative precision, sometimes earns him friendly mockery within the Academy. Some call him the man of definitions, a nod to his constant concern for clarifying terms to eliminate any ambiguity in discussion. Parallel to this, Aristotle takes an interest in observing nature. He likes to examine plants, animals, and confront these concrete realities with the abstract theories he learns. This curiosity sometimes clashes with Platonic idealism, which emphasizes the contemplation of forms rather than the contemplation of matter. Despite this, Plato does not discourage his disciple, considering that any research, as long as it is rationally conducted, can contribute to the enrichment of knowledge. The young Aristotle already keeps some notes that will later help him in the writing of his biological works. He observes the reproduction of animals, the structure of their organs, and attempts to establish conceptual bridges between what he observes in nature and what he studies in philosophy. His study companions, less interested in zoology, sometimes see him as a mind a little too attentive to concrete details. However, several anecdotes reported by ancient authors show that he does not hesitate to defend the necessity of sensory experience to verify or disprove hypotheses. Most of his youthful works have not survived or are known only through fragments or comments by later philosophers. In these snippets, however, one can perceive the desire to reconcile an abstract mathematical-like reasoning with a methodical exploration of the natural world. This dual interest, already perceptible at the Academy, would become Aristotle's distinctive mark. In 347 before Christ, Plato dies at the age of about 80, leaving the Academy orphaned of its founder. The disappearance of this central figure creates a shockwave in the philosophical community. The academics then consult to appoint a successor, and it is Speusippus, Plato's nephew, who ends up leading the institution. This choice is not unanimously applauded. Some members, including Aristotle, question the new direction the Academy will take under this leadership. With Plato's figure no longer there to unite everyone, existing divergences become more pronounced. Speusippus, who now exercises his authority, emphasizes the question of numbers and the classification of beings, seeking to extend Plato's theories in a particular direction. Yet, Aristotle, although imbued with Platonic teachings, gradually developed a thought more oriented towards sensory experience and logic. Observing that the path taken by Speusippus is increasingly diverging from his own concerns, Aristotle feels less affinity with the Academy. This adds to a potential fundamental disagreement. Aristotle begins to question the sharp separation between the sensible world and the intelligible world, born from the Platonic idea that only forms constitute true reality. The young philosopher, by dint of empirical analyses and reflections, wants to deepen the role of material substance. Accounts from this period indicate that he would have then expressed reservations about the direction the Academy was taking in interpreting the theories of the deceased master. Furthermore, it is possible that the political and cultural situation of Athens, still marked by the unpredictability of power relations among Greek city-states, also influences Aristotle's choice. Athens, always proud of its cultural heritage, finds it difficult to accept that a Macedonian could occupy a dominant place in the future of philosophy. Moreover, the rise of Philip II of Macedon begins to arouse increasing distrust in the Greek world. There are no written statements from Aristotle on these specific political aspects at that time, but the prevailing climate may weigh on his decision to leave the city. At the end of this brief philosophical and institutional crisis, Aristotle chooses to leave. Thus, in 347 before Christ, he departs from Athens to go to Assos in Mysia, a region located on the northwest coast of Asia Minor, today near contemporary Turkey. This decision marks the end of his 20 years spent at the Academy, a place that formed him, inspired him, and where much of his intellectual identity was forged. Aristotle's departure becomes, in the history of philosophy, a turning point laden with symbols, the moment when a disciple, after long maturation, feels ready to break away from his master's framework to more freely explore new paths, both philosophical and scientific. At that time, Assos is governed by Hermias, a figure whom the Greeks call a tyrant, a term that often refers to a sole ruler who has not necessarily come to power through inheritance. Contrary to the modern sense of the word tyrant, Hermias is not just an authoritarian ruler. He is also reputed for his intellectual curiosity and his desire to encourage the arts, philosophy, and sciences. The city of Assos, perched on a height overlooking the Aegean Sea, thus benefits from an atmosphere conducive to cultural exchanges and scholarly research. Upon his arrival, Aristotle is warmly welcomed by Hermias, who sees in the presence of Plato's former disciple a unique opportunity to bring renown to his court. Several former members of the Academy also join this small community of exiles. Among them are Xenocrates, future head of the Academy of Athens, and Theophrastus, one of the era's brightest minds, originally from the island of Lesbos. This concentration of thinkers in Assos is remarkable. The place quickly becomes a center of intense philosophical activity, stimulating the exchange of ideas and knowledge. In these daily meetings, each person brings their thoughts and shares their readings, while discussions range from metaphysical domains to the observation of nature. Aristotle's role with Hermias is not that of a mere political advisor. Above all, the philosopher is a scientist in search of knowledge, always driven by the Platonic heritage that values the search for truth, but also by his own empirical inclination that urges him to study concrete phenomena. In this court, Aristotle thus develops several fields of investigation: logic, to formalize reflection and structure reasoning; biology, to analyze the complexity of life; zoology, a still emergent discipline in which he observes and describes the animals of the region; and politics, a crucial subject since he lives in a state governed in a non-traditional manner. Daily conversations thus explore the differences between various systems of government, ideas about justice, but also the methodical classification of reptilian species, or the study of notions of cause and effect. By settling in Assos, Aristotle participates in the birth of a true philosophical community. The group he forms with Xenocrates and Theophrastus acts as a nucleus of collective research. They discuss in the morning, read the books received or imported from Athens, then jot down observations made during walks in the countryside or along the coast. The surrounding forests house many unknown animal species, while the Aegean coast offers marine specimens that can be examined at leisure. Even though the equipment of the time is rudimentary, Aristotle's spirit of observation is already very advanced. He meticulously records the anatomical characteristics of animals, compares their behaviors, and attempts to deduce general laws from them. Sometimes, written or oral exchanges concentrate on how to logically structure this information. Aristotle is convinced that knowledge must be classified and ordered into a coherent system. He is then in the process of elaborating the foundations of a scientific approach based on direct experience and rigorous reasoning, which will influence Western thought for centuries. Hermias, aware of the importance of these works, financially supports the efforts of the small team of philosophers. At a time when books are rare and costly to reproduce, this patronage constitutes a significant asset. In return, the reputation of Assos grows. It begins to be spoken of as an intellectual center outside of Athens, where freedom of thought seems to be preserved. The close ties between Aristotle and Hermias go beyond mere mutual recognition. They are based on mutual admiration. Hermias appreciates the methodical approach of the philosopher, while Aristotle sees in Hermias an enlightened ruler, ready to welcome and finance scholarly activities within his territory. History will remember these few years, lived in Assos, as a moment of creative effervescence, where philosophy and science advance together, hand in hand, to push the boundaries of knowledge. Around 345 or 344. Before Christ, the political atmosphere of the region began to become tense, and Hermias had to deal with external pressures, notably from neighboring powers. In this climate of uncertainty, Aristotle chose to temporarily settle on the island of Lesbos, in Mytilene, accompanied by his close collaborator Theophrastus. The latter, born in Eresos, also on Lesbos, was well acquainted with the local environment. He enthusiastically rediscovered the Mediterranean landscapes of his childhood. Mytilene, one of the island's main cities, was an important cultural center, renowned for its rich maritime exchanges and literary tradition. On site, Aristotle continued and deepened the research begun in Assos, with a particular interest in marine biology. The Aegean Sea surrounding Lesbos was known for its diverse fauna. Fish, mollusks, crustaceans all coexisted in relatively shallow waters, facilitating capture and observation. With the support of Theophrastus, Aristotle embarked on a meticulous study of these life forms, which he deemed essential for understanding the global functioning of nature. The rocky coasts and small coves became open-air laboratories, where the examination of the morphology and behavior of marine animals was complemented by reflections on the classification and evolution of species. As he conducted his explorations, the philosopher compiled detailed notes which would later serve as the basis for his zoological treatises. According to tradition, Aristotle did not just observe, he also practiced dissection to better grasp the internal anatomy of these marine creatures. At a time when human dissections were rare and often taboo, the examination of marine animals appeared to him as a gateway into understanding vital mechanisms. The organs, fluids, skeletal, or cartilaginous structure, everything was cataloged, described, compared. This field-oriented approach, placing concrete experience at the heart of research, represented a major turning point in the history of science. Aristotle broke away from the idea that only abstract speculation from philosophical discussions was a source of truth. For him, the direct observation of facts held paramount importance. This stay on the island of Lesbos was also marked by long discussions between Aristotle and Theophrastus on various subjects: plant physiology, the classification of animal species, or how natural environments influence life. Theophrastus, a true botany enthusiast, conducted with Aristotle studies on the local flora, cataloging the trees, shrubs, and herbs growing on the island. The two men were particularly interested in the growth conditions of plants and their adaptability. This comprehensive observational activity, focused as much on animals as on plants, enabled them to develop a method based on comparing and meticulously examining common and distinctive characteristics. A famous anecdote illustrates Aristotle's enthusiasm for this work of classification. It is said that he patiently cataloged dozens of species of fish and mollusks, not hesitating to get his hands dirty to collect and dissect specimens. His overflowing interest in dissection sometimes shocked the mindset of the time, which was not inclined to handle animal cadavers, but his obsession with knowledge prevailed over the reluctances. The legacy of this period is considerable. The notes accumulated in Mytilene form an essential foundation in the scientific study of biology, even if the practices and measuring instruments remain rudimentary. The research carried out in these places would durably influence Aristotle's reputation as a precursor of the empirical approach. In Mytilene, the philosophical and intellectual dimension was not limited to biology alone. The exchanges with the literati of the island, the influence of local culture, and the opportunity to dialogue with sailors or merchants from diverse backgrounds enriched Aristotle's reflection on the nature of knowledge. He was convinced that the confrontation of multiple viewpoints was a vector of innovation and open-mindedness. The discussions sometimes touched upon questions of logic, rhetoric, or politics, as Aristotle remained a comprehensive thinker, eager to articulate each field of knowledge to develop a global vision of the world. But the priority was clear. Exploring life in all its forms, and especially marine life, constituted the essence of his investigations during this stay. Alongside his scientific and philosophical work, Aristotle gradually weaves more personal ties at the court of Hermias in Assos, and with the circle revolving around the enlightened tyrant. It is in this context that he meets Pythias, about whom ancient sources suggest, in half words, that she is either the niece or the adopted daughter of Hermias. The very existence of these divergent versions indicates the scarcity of precise information about Aristotle's private life. However, everything seems to suggest that the union between the philosopher and Pythias holds particular importance for consolidating political and familial alliances. Through this marriage, Aristotle draws closer to Hermias, sealing a form of pact of trust and mutual respect. The exact date of these nuptials is unknown, but most historians place the event around 345 before Christ, during the years when Aristotle resided between Assos and Mytilene. The impact of this marriage on the philosopher's daily life should not be underestimated. Indeed, the presence of Pythias offers him emotional stability in a world marked by political uncertainty. Alliances between cities are fragile, and it's not uncommon for a leader to be ousted or overthrown depending on the shifting balance of power. Being connected to Hermias through family ties represents a safety net for Aristotle in this troubled context. It allows him to focus on his studies and delve deeper into his research without the fear of sudden expulsion or a drastic break with his protectors. Epistolary exchanges of the time, as well as indirect testimonies, suggest that Aristotle is deeply attached to Pythias, even if this sentimental aspect is not always highlighted by chroniclers, who tend to focus more on political and military achievements. Aristotle and Pythias's married life remains shrouded in mysteries. Historical documents on this subject are relatively rare, and ancient philosophers tend to dwell more on intellectual rather than domestic aspects. However, it's probable that Pythias participated in her manner in the small scholarly community. Women of high rank in certain Greek cities could receive knowledge in literature and management, thus playing a significant role in household organization and sometimes in reflection. It's also worth remembering that in antiquity, marriage has a civic and political dimension. Beyond the feelings that may exist between spouses, the union aims to solidify ties, transmit a legacy, and forge strong alliances. The few milestones available to posterity indicate that the union of Aristotle and Pythias meets these objectives. It provides the philosopher with a recognizable status and social support, which he values for pursuing his studies in peace. The personality of Pythias largely eludes us, but the fact that she is so close to Hermias suggests that she grew up in an environment open to literature and intellectual debates. It's reasonable to think that she supports Aristotle in his work, or, at the very least, respects it. The relative freedom enjoyed by the philosopher in organizing his day, devoted to teaching and studying, reflects an implicit agreement between the two spouses. Pythias's life is undoubtedly not limited to the role of a passive wife, even if the sources rarely echo her exact activities. Historians sometimes hypothesize that she may have managed part of the property and correspondence, or even established relations with other influential families, which would further strengthen Aristotle's position. By 343. Before Christ, Macedonia is already victorious in several confrontations and gradually imposes regional dominance. Philip II, aware of the importance of diplomacy and education to consolidate his authority, primarily wishes to prepare his son and heir, Alexander, for the throne. Alexander, then a teenager, shows undeniable signs of intelligence and curiosity, coupled with a fiery temperament that intrigues many Macedonians. To shape a future king who is both cultured and competent, Philip II decides to call upon one of the brightest minds in the Greek world, Aristotle. The latter's reputation has already been firmly established, first as a student and then as a notable teacher at Plato's Academy in Athens, before leaving the city to continue his work in Asia Minor. Choosing an exceptional tutor for the heir is not insignificant. In Macedonia, the concept of royal education intertwines with that of power. The person who shapes the prince largely influences future policy, as their impact on the young ruler can be decisive. Moreover, prolonged contact with an accomplished intellectual is a means for Philip II to immerse his son in the philosophical debates that then stir the Greek world. The city-states of the South, renowned for their culture and intellectual traditions, often regard Macedonia as peripheral, far removed from Athenian refinement. In an effort to counter this judgment, Philip II aspires to make the Macedonian court a place where both warfare and the arts are cultivated. In this context, Aristotle emerges as an ideal choice, given his diverse skills: philosophy, natural sciences, logic, ethics, politics, and rhetoric. When Aristotle arrives in Pella, the Macedonian capital of the time, he finds himself in an environment he partially already knows. His father, Nicomachus, had served as a physician at the Macedonian court, providing his son with an initial connection to this monarchy. Although several years have passed, the court's atmosphere remains influenced by Philip II's dominance. The king is not only a conscientious strategist, but also a patron of the arts and sciences, who enthusiastically welcomes the philosopher's arrival. Beyond mutual trust, Philip II is eager for his son to acquire a wide range of knowledge. The aim is to educate him both militarily, an area where Alexander already excels, and intellectually, to introduce him to ideas of political organization, morality, and enlightened governance. In Pella, Aristotle promptly begins his mission to serve as Alexander's tutor. The initial encounters between the philosopher and his pupil likely unfold formally, in rooms designated for instruction or in cultivated gardens. These interactions, initially tentative, are structured around a comprehensive curriculum designed by Aristotle to spark the young prince's curiosity. This curriculum reflects the tutor's concern to blend philosophical rigor with practical application, enabling Alexander to not only grasp theories, but also apply them. Greek philosophy indeed offers various paths for reflection, from metaphysics to mathematics, rhetoric, and ethics. Aristotle, trained under Plato, had already developed his own critical sense, particularly regarding the value of direct observation of reality. He aims to impart to Alexander a strong appreciation for research and analysis. His teaching methods sometimes diverge from mere text recitation, incorporating stimulating discussions or long walks where master and pupil freely exchange ideas. Historical sources suggest that Aristotle advocates a balance between purely intellectual studies and practice, convinced that knowledge flourishes through experimentation. In this setting, Aristotle initiates Alexander into ethics. Where some aristocrats prioritize displays of strength and wealth, the philosopher emphasizes the concept of virtue. He explains to his pupil the importance of cultivating temperance, fairness, and responsibility, reminding him that a sovereign must be a model for his subjects. For Aristotle, kingship is not merely a privilege, but a service to the city. According to the testimonies of the time, the philosopher may have detailed to Alexander the famous doctrine of the mean, which involves maintaining an equal distance from excess and deficiency. The goal is to achieve self-control, essential for a political leader. This education complements Alexander's military training, already noted for his bravery and thirst for achievements. Simultaneously, Aristotle endeavors to acquaint the young prince with politics. He describes the different existing systems: monarchy, aristocracy, democracy, oligarchy, etc. He encourages him to examine the constitutions of the city-states to understand their strengths and weaknesses. This comparative analysis, it is argued, will later inspire Alexander when he embarks on the conquest of the Persian Empire and needs to govern diverse territories. The philosopher's key idea is to convince his pupil that a good king must surround himself with enlightened advisors and respect local customs, while imposing a certain political unity under the aegis of Greek culture. Teaching sessions are not limited to abstract subjects. Aristotle, a great observer of nature, considered it essential to train Alexander's mind through direct experiences. He therefore organized, according to tradition, several expeditions in the field. Away from the court enclosures, the master and disciple supposedly roamed the countryside and forests to study the local flora and fauna. They observed animal species, took an interest in medicinal plants, and commented on the subtleties of the environment. Such excursions complemented the young prince's education by instilling in him the value of methodical observation. Neither the soldier nor the future king, according to Aristotle, could afford to ignore the precise view of the physical world to understand the laws governing it. A frequently recounted anecdote about these scientific walks, it is said that Aristotle took Alexander, still an adolescent, to the other end of the region to examine rare botanical specimens. This approach perfectly illustrates the philosopher's method, placing experience and direct knowledge of nature at the heart of learning. During these expeditions, Alexander became familiar with animal dissections, soil analyses, and the classification of plants. According to some sources, the young prince was fascinated by the anatomical descriptions provided by his tutor, notably discovering how the structure of a living creature could reflect its function in the ecosystem. This approach greatly influenced Alexander's intellectual curiosity, and he would always maintain a certain interest in natural phenomena throughout his career as a conqueror. The tutor-student relationship went far beyond merely imparting knowledge. Aristotle, aware of acting for posterity, aimed to shape in Alexander not only education, but also the soul of a visionary leader. The philosopher did not neglect the practical dimension of things: how to negotiate with subjugated cities, how to use diplomacy to rally allies, and how to manage non-Greek populations. The joint work of the master and the student, according to historical accounts, took place in a climate of mutual trust. Certainly Alexander remained impatient, at times prideful, but he listened to Aristotle's advice and took advantage of his encyclopedic knowledge. For his part, Aristotle appreciated the lively spirit and insatiable curiosity of his young pupil, sensing that he was nurturing a singular character destined for an exceptional fate. Aristotle's teachings left a lasting impression on Alexander's mind. One of the essential notions the philosopher endeavored to convey concerned the vision of politics and, more specifically, the issue of individual freedom. In the Greek city-state, the idea of a free man was defined in opposition to servitude or subjugation imposed by a master. For Aristotle, training a head of state meant making him understand that governing involves ensuring a form of justice to maintain social cohesion. Alexander, far removed from abstract theories, gradually integrated this idea and considered that the conquered peoples should be allowed to retain a semblance of dignity and freedom. In practice, this ideal would often clash with the pressing need to maintain military control over entire regions. Nevertheless, when observing how Alexander treated local populations in the conquered Persian Empire, one can perceive the philosopher's influence in certain conciliatory approaches, at least initially. Another key concept is the pan-Hellenic vision. Thinkers of the time often encouraged Greek city-states to set aside their internal rivalries to focus on external dangers, particularly the Persian power. Aristotle, partly aligning with this trend, emphasizes the importance of Greek unity. However, he is critical of the idea of Greece's total supremacy over all barbarians. His student, however, would mostly retain the ambition to unite the Greeks under one leader to launch large-scale operations against the Achaemenid Empire. This political orientation, encouraged by Philip II, would be amplified by Alexander when he succeeded his father, leading a vast military campaign to the east. Some sources suggest that Aristotle inspired the idea of a Hellenistic world where Greek culture, far from being limited to narrow boundaries, would radiate across vast territories. It is even said that through his conversations with Alexander, he helped him conceptualize the diffusion of the Greek language, philosophy, and civic elements wherever the Macedonian armies would go. By the time Alexander becomes king, around 336 before Christ, following the assassination of Philip II, the relationship between the former student and the master begins to evolve. It is evident that the apprentice, now a sovereign, feels invested with a glorious mission. Some sources mention tensions that might have arisen from their differing views, particularly on how to treat foreign populations. Aristotle, faithful to his intellectual foundations, probably defends a more nuanced view than Alexander's plans for military expansion. Opinions differ, however, on the closeness they maintain during these years. It is known that Alexander retains great respect for his former tutor, to whom he sometimes sends animal or plant specimens discovered during his initial campaigns. These deliveries, seemingly anecdotal, prove that the sovereign has not forgotten the long days spent studying nature with Aristotle. In parallel, the philosopher maintains a certain independence of mind. It is not uncommon, in a context where Macedonia is on the rise, for a renowned thinker to exercise the necessary caution not to blindly associate with power. Historians remind us that Aristotle does not necessarily endorse all of Alexander's actions. He remains attached to the idea that politics should be regulated by morality, that conquest has its limits, and that respect for free cities is essential. However, he also knows how to adapt to reality. The Macedonian, now king, launches a long-planned war against the Persian Empire. Aristotle, established again in Athens from 335 before Christ onwards, no longer exerts on his former disciple's mind as direct an influence as when he was at court. Nevertheless, the seeds sown during these formative years have borne fruit. Alexander, whose reputation is forged through his military successes, retains certain conceptual ties. The idea that studying the world allows for better governance, that knowledge can legitimize power, and that Greek culture is destined to spread far beyond the Aegean. Even if the conquest sometimes turns into brutal occupation, Alexander multiplies the founding of cities, often named Alexandria, serving as centers to host a Greco-Macedonian elite and to spread the Greek language and civilization. Many historians emphasize how this program of urban foundations reflects, at least in part, the training received from a philosopher who saw in the city the ideal place to develop civic virtues and rational study. When Aristotle returns to Athens, he does not come alone. He is surrounded by collaborators and students who believe in his method, particularly this pronounced taste for concrete observation of the world. He also brings with him the notoriety gained over the years spent at the Macedonian court. His ties with Alexander, now king, confer a particular status on Aristotle. He is perceived both as a philosopher and as a man with the ear of power. Nevertheless, his teaching project does not depend solely on his network. He relies primarily on the conviction that it is time to found a school capable of surpassing purely idealistic approaches while integrating what is most solid in the Platonic tradition. Aristotle decided to establish the Lyceum, in Greek Lekion, also known as Lycée in some Latin translations, in this environment, blending academic heritage and new aspirations. This place, which he would transform into a true hub of teaching and research, is located to the east of Athens, not far from a sanctuary dedicated to Apollo Lycaos. There, he found an environment conducive to reflection and discussion, as well as a space large enough to accommodate disciples interested in his methodical approach and his desire to classify all knowledge. Once settled in Athens, Aristotle set about structuring his school in an unprecedented way. Though he partly drew inspiration from Plato's Academy, he developed at the Lyceum a more broadly scientific approach, favoring observation and methodical study. He surrounded himself with curious minds, willing to explore all facets of knowledge. Quickly, he established two fundamental infrastructures, a library and a museum, in the ancient sense of the term, meaning a place dedicated to the muses, guardians of the arts and sciences. The library is crucial. Aristotle wanted to gather as many writings as possible, whether philosophical texts, mathematical treatises, poetry books, or historical documents. Some manuscripts came from his travels in Asia Minor, in contacts made with scholars from various backgrounds. Others were copied from works preserved by Plato's Academy in a spirit of preservation and critical comparison. The disciples of the Lyceum often participated in this work of collection and copying, thus forming a real community of scribes and readers. In parallel, Aristotle envisioned a space for the study of nature, which he himself called a museum, or a collection of natural curiosities. At the time, the idea of storing animal, plant, and even mineral specimens seemed innovative for a philosophy school. But for Aristotle, no domain of reality is foreign to knowledge. He sought to establish classifications, conduct dissections, and observe living things in all their forms. The Lyceum thus became a center for empirical research, where one did not hesitate to concretely analyze an object, an organism, or a phenomenon to better uncover general principles. It is also within this organization that the famous peripatetic method appeared, the designation coming from the Greek peripatein, meaning to walk around. According to tradition, Aristotle liked to teach while walking, pacing the alleys of the Lyceum with his disciples who listened and discussed around him. This teaching style encourages active participation. Students ask questions, propose objections, and enrich the common reflection while strolling. The atmosphere is both studious and lively, far from the too solemn framework that some imagine for ancient philosophy. A frequently told anecdote about this suggests that the inhabitants of Athens, sometimes intrigued by these groups of people discussing while walking, began to call them peripatetics. The term could have taken root either in this behavior of didactic walking or in the fact that the Lyceum was itself situated in a place of passage and promenade near the sanctuary of Apollo. According to this legend, Aristotle even encouraged this practice to stimulate concentration. He thought that bodily movement helped to structure reasoning. One of the remarkable features of the Lyceum is the diversity of teachings offered. Unlike Plato's Academy, whose orientation is more toward mathematics and the quest for ideas, Aristotle wanted to cover all domains of knowledge. To do this, he structured his school around different disciplines, which he explored with a particularly systematic spirit. Aristotle was aware that every science requires a rigorous method. This is where logic comes in, which he sometimes called the instrument, or organon, in the sense of a conceptual tool to organize thought. In his research, he developed the syllogism, a mode of reasoning structured around premises and a necessary conclusion. By relying on logic, he sought to establish the foundations that would allow other disciplines to flourish. It is said that his disciples regularly practiced defining and classifying concepts, so much so that Aristotle was sometimes nicknamed the man of definitions for his rigorous precision. Aristotle's passion for observing the living world led him to devote long periods to zoology and botany. Encouraged by their master, the members of the Lyceum collected specimens and conducted dissections to understand the morphology and functioning of animal species. Similarly, they studied the growth and reproduction of plants, classified according to innovative criteria. This comprehensive approach to the living world was unprecedented in a philosophical school, and Aristotle wrote several treatises such as History of Animals or Parts of Animals, in which he described hundreds of species, ranging from simple mollusks to more complex mammals. Aristotle taught that ethics is a pillar of life in society. In his Nicomachean Ethics, a work probably discussed with his disciples at the Lyceum, he emphasized the notion of the golden mean, which he considered fundamental to avoiding both excess and deficiency in human conduct. Concurrently, politics was addressed in a spirit of comparative analysis. Aristotle and his students examined several constitutions of Greek city-states to determine what worked best. The members of the Lyceum thus focused on structuring the city, the place of citizens, and the laws necessary to maintain order. In the interest of studying all forms of expression, Aristotle also incorporated the study of poetry and rhetoric into the Lyceum's program. He was interested in how to persuade an audience and the mechanisms of tragedy, which was considered a major art form in Greece. In his work, Poetics, Aristotle analyzed the structure of drama, the functions of the chorus, and the role of catharsis, this phenomenon of purification of emotions through theatrical spectacle. As for rhetoric, he considered it an essential art for anyone wishing to speak in public, defending the idea that it could serve the truth when used honestly. Finally, Aristotle addressed metaphysics as a reflection on universals, first causes, and the ultimate nature of reality. He sometimes criticized Plato's purely idealistic approach, while acknowledging the importance of studying these questions at the top of the hierarchy of knowledge. At the Lyceum, this discipline was appreciated by those who wished to go beyond simple observation of the world. Aristotle's interest in classifying everything that exists, material or immaterial, allowed him to propose an extensive system of thought, organized around the notion of substance and the concept of form that materializes in matter. The Lyceum was not just a space for storing books or a haven for scientific research. It was also a living community where people shared meals, discussions, and writing work. The days there were very structured. According to some sources, Aristotle and his disciples distinguished two teaching moments, one called esoteric, reserved for the most advanced students eager to examine logic or metaphysics in detail, the other, exoteric, open to a broader audience and focusing on more accessible subjects, sometimes related to morals, politics, or eloquence. In the morning, at dawn, the esoteric teaching might take place. Disciples who wished to deepen their understanding of philosophy in its most complex aspects would sit with Aristotle to examine a text, debate a conceptual difficulty, or analyze a natural phenomenon. The master encouraged them to question every definition, challenge arguments, and compare different sources. Intellectual rigor was a must. It was about building a coherent system of knowledge, starting from the most fundamental principles. In the afternoon, the Lyceum was more lively. Besides the confirmed students, cultured Athenians or mere curious individuals could come to listen to speeches or partake in public debates. It might be at this time that Aristotle undertook his famous philosophical walks, or encouraged his listeners to argue on a given topic. The Lyceum's gardens, adorned with colonnades, paths, and nooks, conducive to small group discussions, provided an ideal setting for these meetings. In practical terms, daily life was punctuated by communal meals and numerous practical exercises, notably in the field of natural sciences. Some anecdotes mention collective dissections, where Aristotle would show an animal's organ to his disciples to help them understand the internal functions of living beings. Members of the Lyceum recorded their observations in notebooks, which they then compared with previous notes. In this way, a true accumulation of data was formed, allowing for cross-referencing and fueling new hypotheses. As the Lyceum's reputation grew, Aristotle wrote and compiled treatises covering almost all the aforementioned fields. This body of work, sometimes called the organon for the logical part, includes the physics, focused on the study of the principles of the natural world, the metaphysics, dealing with being as being, the Nicomachean ethics, the foundation of his doctrine of the mean, the poetics, exploring the nature of drama and tragedy, and other works dedicated to animals, the soul, or language. Some of these texts were read publicly or semi-publicly at the Lyceum, providing Athenians the opportunity to discover areas of knowledge hitherto unexplored, or at least presented from a new perspective. Aristotle's most advanced disciples were encouraged to analyze these treatises, comment on them, and sometimes enrich them. At the time, the notion of publication did not coincide with our modern conception of the printed book. Nevertheless, the influence of these writings was significant. They circulated in the form of scrolls, copied by scribes and transported from city to city, helping to make the Lyceum an essential center of thought. The peripatetic approach was not just a teaching style. It permeated the way knowledge was acquired. Aristotle emphasized the necessity of collecting empirical data before formulating general principles, but he also reminded of the importance of logical reasoning to correctly connect facts. The discoveries and methods of the Lyceum would have a lasting impact on the development of philosophy and natural sciences, not only in the Greek world but also later in the Roman, medieval, and Arab Muslim worlds. In this period, from 335 to 323 before Christ, Aristotle thus led an institution that revolutionized the way of thinking. The Lyceum became a dynamic research hub where philosophy, science, logic, ethics, and politics were studied systematically. Students learned to ask the question, why, and attempt to answer it through a careful examination of nature and society. It is no accident that Aristotle's manuscripts would traverse the centuries, prompting comments, critiques, and inspirations from countless later scholars. In 323, before Christ, a major event shook the Greek world. Alexander the Great, king of Macedonia, and conqueror of a vast empire extending from Greece to India, died in Babylon. It should be recalled that Alexander had cemented Macedonian dominance over many Greek city-states, including Athens, once a powerful city-state in Attica. The impetus of this young king had deeply altered political balances throughout the Mediterranean basin. The Athenians, whose national pride remained vivid despite the loss of their former glory, reacted to Alexander's sudden death with a mixture of hope and fear. In their minds, the death of the conqueror could offer an opportunity to break free from Macedonian influence, or even to rekindle their past political ambitions. However, this situation also generated much uncertainty. On one hand, Athens perceived the power vacuum at the top of the Macedonian Empire as an opening to redefine its role and regain a certain prestige. On the other hand, these changes risked provoking a chain of internal and external conflicts. A stormy atmosphere is then forming. The resentment against Macedonian tutelage, already latent in certain Athenian circles, quickly transforms into hostile movements. In public assemblies, several orators, convinced that the city can regain its independence, harangue the crowd. Amidst this growing political tension, attention quickly turns to influential personalities who could symbolize a direct link with the Macedonian court. Indeed, the figure of Aristotle rapidly becomes a focal point. Many Athenians consider him too close to the Macedonian elite. On a practical level, the city is in a state of turmoil. Nationalist orators like Hyperides become influential. A xenophobic wave targeting Macedonian supporters surges, and anyone suspected of collusion with the occupier faces significant social pressure. Macedonians residing in Athens become more discreet, and political allies of the Macedonian court fear that Athenian courts, always quick to initiate public trials, might launch symbolic proceedings against them. These trials often take on the accusation of impiety, a charge that, in the Athenian tradition, serves as much to punish real blasphemies as to eliminate political opponents. The climate quickly worsens. Debates in the popular assembly of the Ecclesia harden, and Aristotle's figure is on everyone's lips. How can this famous thinker, close to the court, exonerate himself from the responsibility for Macedonia's actions? Sometimes a simple rumor suffices, and in Aristotle's case, a concrete charge emerges: impiety. The great philosopher then faces one of the most delicate trials of his life. To better understand, in the Greek city, impiety, or asebeia, is not just a theological offense. It is a convenient pretext for politically attacking a troublesome personality. Several decades earlier, Socrates had already been accused of impiety and sentenced to death in 399 before Christ, in the wake of the convulsions of the Peloponnesian War. Although he had lived in Athens for a long period and founded his school there, he was not born an Athenian citizen and does not have the same protection as a native influential in the city. The most vehement Athenians directly attack him, bringing up rumors that he once glorified Hermias of Atarneus, a figure already linked to Macedonia, or speculations about the role he played in the education of Alexander. To some, he had corrupted the mind of the future conqueror towards domination. According to tradition, Aristotle senses the danger and anticipates the consequences of a court appearance. Many disciples urge him to quietly leave Athens to find safety, arguing that a trial in this hostile atmosphere could easily result in capital punishment. The city, swollen with pride and patriotic exaltation, would not hesitate to sacrifice the philosopher to demonstrate a break with Macedonian control. Therefore, Aristotle decides to leave, not wishing to expose his family or his close ones, including his young son Nicomachus and several loyal disciples, to potential reprisals. An anecdote reported by various ancient sources claims that Aristotle then declared he did not want Athens to sin twice against philosophy. He was referring to the tragic case of Socrates, condemned to death for similar reasons when the city was seeking a scapegoat for its political frustrations. By willingly leaving the city, the philosopher assumes the role of the exile, who saves both his life and, in his mind, the honor of philosophy. Aristotle's escape takes him to Chalcis, a locality situated on the island of Euboea, not far from the Boeotian coast. While some imagine that this retreat was carried out under the protection of Macedonian guards, nothing seems to confirm this with certainty. However, what is clear is that the philosopher did not want to risk a political trial. His arrival in Chalcis is marked by a certain discretion. He does not seek to found a new school, as he had done in Athens, and he seldom appears in public to speak on politics. In Chalcis, Aristotle's maternal family owned property, which allowed him, at least partially, to live in an environment less exposed to the hostility of the Athenians. But the wound remains fresh. The city where he had worked so much to spread knowledge, creating libraries, collecting natural specimens, and teaching dozens of young minds eager for science, had almost forced him to flee. Once arrived in Chalcis, Aristotle must adapt to a more subdued way of life, far from the philosophical hustle that characterized Athens. He still has his books, his notes, and his most loyal students, but the dynamic is no longer the same. The Lyceum, his Athenian school, now operates in his absence, partly entrusted to Theophrastus, his brightest disciple and longtime friend. However, psychological pressure is not the only thing he endures. According to various traditions, Aristotle suffers from chronic ailments that worsen with age. Hypotheses circulate about the origin of his illness. Some authors mention a digestive disorder or an issue of extreme fatigue related to accumulated stress. It is possible that he never fully recovered from his intense activity years at the Lyceum, where he simultaneously led teaching, research, and writing. It is also plausible that political and personal upheavals, particularly linked to Alexander's death and his own flight, may have exacerbated his suffering. Be that as it may, in Chalcis, his condition gradually deteriorates. In a context where medicine depends largely on medicinal herbs, specific diets, and practices from the Hippocratic school, Aristotle, whose father was a doctor, probably knows treatments to soothe his body. However, it is likely that this ancient medical science is not sufficient to alleviate all the symptoms of a serious pathology. Aristotle's health progressively worsens during the year 322. Before Christ, historians, lacking precise medical documents, can only hypothesize about the exact cause of his death. But what clearly emerges is that the philosopher, weakened morally by exile and physically by his ailments, passes away in relatively simple circumstances. He was about 62 years old, already a respectable age for the time. The same year, the city of Athens is shaken by the deaths of other prominent figures. Thus, Demosthenes, a famous orator and fierce opponent of Macedonia, also dies in 322 before Christ. This succession of symbolic deaths, Alexander the previous year, then Aristotle and Demosthenes, contributes to marking the end of an era. The circumstances of Aristotle's death therefore remain tinged with a form of melancholy. The man who had traveled Greece from west to east, from Stagira in Chalcidice to Athens, then to Assos and Mytilene, before returning to the Macedonian court, expires away from the honors that would have been due to him. He is not buried in the city that he profoundly marked intellectually, but in a more discreet place in Euboea. Funeral rites are nonetheless organized by his close ones. Funerals in the Greek world generally included the transport of the body, ritual lamentations led by the women of the family, and a burial or cremation accompanied by offerings. Aristotle's disciples, although dispersed, have probably sought to express their gratitude to the man who taught them the importance of observation, logic, and conceptual rigor. After the death of Aristotle, his legacy revolves around two essential elements: his library and notes on one hand, and the leadership of the Lyceum on the other. Theophrastus, his loyal companion from the island of Lesbos, inherits the leadership of the school. He also receives the master's manuscripts, compiling an impressive collection of texts dealing with metaphysics, logic, grouped under the general title of organon, rhetoric, ethics, including the Nicomachean ethics named after Aristotle's son, politics, poetics, and natural sciences, zoology, botany, the study of reproduction, among others. The precious content of these treatises, preserved through the centuries thanks to successive copies, will become the foundation for many philosophical and scientific reflections in the ancient world, and much later in the Middle Ages and up to our time. Legend has it that Theophrastus, having become the leader of the Peripatetic school, organized a sort of vigil to prevent the master's texts from being lost or confiscated by political opponents seeking to discredit this thought deemed very connected to the Macedonian vocabulary and heritage. It is also said that some disciples, dispersed in other Greek cities or even within the Macedonian administration, kept in epistolary contact with Theophrastus and regularly requested comments on obscure passages of Aristotle. Aristotle's legacy goes far beyond the borders of his time and continues to permeate our way of thinking, organizing society, and exploring the world. By laying the foundations of formal logic, he structured scientific reasoning, influencing both mathematics and contemporary artificial intelligence. His approach to the classification of living beings served as the foundation for modern biology, paving the way for the discoveries of Linnaeus and Darwin. His reflections on physics and causality shaped scientific thought for nearly 2 millennia, and even though the Galilean Revolution surpassed him, his concept of causes remains a fundamental tool in philosophy and social sciences. In the domain of ethics and politics, he introduced principles that still structure today's debates on governance, citizenship, and the pursuit of the common good. The idea that man is a social being, shaped by his political and moral environment, resonates in modern democracies and educational systems. His analysis of theater and narration laid the foundations of structured storytelling, influencing even the contemporary entertainment industry, from classical theater to Hollywood movie scripts. Meanwhile, Greece continues its path towards the so-called Hellenistic period, characterized by the fragmentation of Alexander the Great's legacy into several rival kingdoms. During this time, the shadow of Aristotle will continue to loom over philosophy and all forms of knowledge, inspiring many generations of thinkers through the ages.